So before we go ahead and get started, I want to make one announcement. So tomorrow is the first kind of stats research methods seminar speaker. So we have Sakshi from the University of Oxford, and she's going to be talking about diversity in research methods, which I think is an important topic. So tomorrow she's going to have a talk at 12 and it's going to run until about 1. So if you're available and are interested in this, please do attend. There is free food, and I've been told that the food is way better than the social and the COG seminar lunches. So if that's enticing to you, I would definitely recommend coming and checking it out. I think it should be a good talk. So how's everyone doing on this wonderful Monday morning? Yeah, everyone's doing okay? Good, I like to hear it. All right, so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be continuing our discussion of multi-level modeling. But what I wanted to do first was a little recap of what we went over last week. So in what situation should we use multi-level models? So if we have a nested design or repeated measures design or longitudinal data, really we should be using multi-level modeling with any type of complex design where we have between and within subject variables. Why do we use multi-level models? Well, it allows us to ask really interesting questions, and it allows us to capture variance at the between and the within groups. And it also allows us to use designs that might have non-independence. So when we have clustered data, multi-level models allow us to account for that. And then what are multi-level models? They're basically just linear models that we know and love with some extra residual terms. So we went over this on Wednesday of last week. Again, we're just adding residual terms to our model. That's essentially it. So hopefully it's not too intimidating for you. So are there any questions about the content that we went over last week? Any dying questions, comments? Again, we're going to continue our conversation today. And if you have any questions, please ask. So today what I want to do is I want to try to tell you everything you need to know to run and report a multi-level model. So specifically what I want to do is I want to talk about how you organize your data for multi-level model analysis in R. I want to talk about estimation. So we're going to talk about maximum likelihood estimation. I want to talk about how you fit and interpret multi-level models. I want to talk a little bit about visualization, effect size, reporting multi-level models, and power. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff today, but this is not exhaustive. There might be some questions that you may have that I don't cover. If you have those questions, please ask me. If you don't want to ask during the lecture itself, we can meet on Wednesday. You can ask me the questions on Wednesday. You can also come to my office hours. Again, I can't cover everything, but there might be something that's related to your research that you're interested in and you have questions on that I may not cover. So please do not hesitate to ask me. So these are the packages that I'll be using during the lecture. So make sure you have these installed. The Cordo document lives on the GitHub, so you can download that and then follow along. So today we're going to use some data that I collected when I was a postdoc at the University of Iowa. This is not published data. It's not particularly good, but this is the data that we're going to use today. So what I did is we had individuals come into the lab and we monitored their eye movements. Specifically, we looked at their pupil size. So pupil size is an indicator of mental effort or cognitive effort. So the more mental effort you exert, the larger your pupil size is. So what we did is we had individuals come into the lab. We had them listen to clear speech. So it was just like a word token. And this was the normal speech condition. And then we also had them listen to 6-channel vocoded speech. This was meant to emulate what an individual with cochlear implant might hear. So I just have an example of what that would sound like. So this is way harder than what they actually heard. So in our experiment, we just presented them with actual single words. This is actual sentence. And this to me is a little harder. So this is what they would hear essentially. So can't really hear it that well, but can anybody make that out? Probably not. But that's what we presented to individuals in our experiment. So in this case, with what I just laid out here, what would be our fixed factor and what would be our random factor? So going back to last week. So in this very simple design, what's our fixed factor? Yeah, the type of speech they heard. Do you remember why we would label this as a fixed factor?
Everyone listens to either one or the other.
So in this particular design, they listen to both. So yeah, so both clear and vocoded speech. So if you remember last week, we talked about instances where we would label something as fixed as opposed to random. So if we have an experimental manipulation, that's always going to be a fixed factor in our model, right? Because that's what we care about. And if you remember, the fixed factor are our population average effects. And this should be unchanging between experiments, right? So individuals will always hear normal speech and vocoded speech in the experiment itself. So we would put that as a fixed factor. What about a random factor? What would be our random factor in this case? Yeah, participant. So in this case, participant would be a random factor. And why would we have participant as a random factor? So what did we say a random factor was? Yeah, so the participants is a random factor, but why would it be a random factor?
Because it causes dependency of the data.
It causes dependency of the data. So last week we talked about a particular specific definition of a random factor, right? So it's usually a subset of the population that we're interested in, right? So if it's a subset of the population that we're interested in, we want that as a random factor, right? Because we want to generalize it to the population of interest. And because participants, we're not collecting every single participant in the population, we would label that as a random factor in this design, right? So things like participants, schools, items, pictures, those type of things would be random factors because they're a subset of the population that we're interested in. Yeah.
So if you have like a variable that's like complete, it's not a subset, then it doesn't have to be.
So that's an interesting question, right? So do you have an example?
Say you have a survey instrument.
Yeah.
You have 10 items.
Yeah.
And that's all towards the survey instrument.
That's interesting. So so I probably would put item as a random factor. So like I've experienced this with like test questions, right? So I have a test after someone does a memory test, right? And there's 10 questions or 10 items. I would put that as a random factor, right? Because it's still a subsample of a population of all possible test items, right? So it's possible there could be other conceptualizations of those items that we didn't test for, right? And we want to capture the variability between those items. So it's possible that there is, substantial variability between those items, right? Or those test questions. So we'd want to account for that variability. So I would put that as a random factor. There could be situations where like you've exhausted every single thing in the population, right? Where the population consists of like 3 things and you've sampled those 3 things. Then conceivably you might not want to put that as a random factor, right? We could put that as a fixed effect or something like that. But yeah, good question. So if you want to follow along, I have the data. So if you read in this I data here, that will load in the data set. And what I have is just a visualization of the data here. So what we were interested in is mean pupil size per trial. And that's what I have depicted here. So Psych 503 folks know that I love rain cloud plots. So that's what I have depicted here. But hopefully you can see that in the vocoded condition here, the mean pupil size is a little larger than the normal speech. And that makes sense. Vocoded speech is a lot harder than normal speech here. So we can see that it's a little larger here. As we'll see, the effect is pretty small. So let's talk a little bit about data organization. So when we are going to perform a multi-level model analysis in R, we need to have our data in long format, not wide format. So I have an example here of what the data would look like in wide format, where our higher level units are just on one row here, right? So we have plot ID, and then there's 3 observations, so 1 for each row. In long format, what we do is we take our higher level units and basically we replicate them so there's multiple rows. And we can see that in this particular instance here, right, where we have plot ID 1, and then we also have another row for 1, and then another row for 1 with multiple measurements. This is how the data needs to be organized in R. If you were going to use something like SPSS or M+, it requires your data to be in wide format. So this is kind of just kind of walks you through how you would take your data from wide format to long format. So pretty straightforward. This highlights the pivot longer function from the tidyverse, which I love. I recommend using something like this to do that, but you might have another method in base R or something else that you like to take your data from wide to long. Doesn't matter as long as it's in long format. It doesn't matter what you use to do it. So if we read in our data or look at our data set, we'll see something like this. Our data is already in long format, right? So we have subject, which is our kind of level 2 variable, right? And there's one row per subject, or excuse me, there's multiple rows per subjects. Then we have a trial column with each trial. And then we have the vocoded condition. So on each trial, individuals either heard a vocoded word or a normal speech word. And then we have mean pupil size per trial here. So this is how the data should be structured. Here in our data, level 1 is going to be the trial level. And vocoded is a level 1 variable at the trial level. Again, it varies, right? So trial 3, vocoded, and maybe trial 10 would be normal speech. And then our level 2 in this data is the subject level. So we have trials nested in subjects. So a concept that's really, really important in multi-level modeling is centering. So in single level or traditional regression, what's the purpose of centering? Why do we center in single level or traditional regression? How would we center our continuous variables?
It makes the intercept.
Yep. So it makes the intercept more interpretable, right? So instead of, the value of y when x equals 0, 0 might not be sensical. If we center that variable, then it becomes the mean, so it's more interpretable. What is another reason why we might want to center? It has to do with interactions. So what happens if we take two variables and multiply them together? It starts with an M. Yeah, so there's issues with multicollinearity, right? When you multiply two variables, if we center those variables and then multiply them, there is no multicollinearity. So that's another reason why we might want to center our data. So in multi-level modeling, we talked a little bit about this last week, right? So multi-level modeling allows us to ask really interesting questions at the between level and at the within level. But if we want to ask those questions, we actually need to center. Centering becomes really, really important. What I wanted to do is walk through some examples of like a between and within question, just so you get an idea of kind of what those questions might be. So if we have questions, within the context that we're interested in. So in this example, we have student achievement on the x-axis and then self-concept. So how does student achievement relate to self-concept? We might be interested at the within level. So within school, right? How student achievement relates to self-concept. So an individual might be high achieving and that might be related to high self-concept, right? They feel good about themselves, right? Within school. We might have questions between school. So here we're interested in the mean student achievement at the school level and how that relates to mean self-concept, right? So at the school level, you might have really high student achievement, but that might be related to low self-concept, right? Because people are trying really hard to compete with their colleagues. The contextual effects are really interesting here too. So contextual effects is the influence of the context on the individual level, right? At the individual level outcome, which would be self-concept here. So here we have to imagine that we have a particular student within school. That student comes from a school that has a certain level of achievement, right? So let's say that you are a high achieving student, but you're in a school that's fairly mediocre. What is the influence of going from that particular school to another school? right? So let's say that you went to a small liberal arts college and then you're placed into Princeton, right? Where it's high achieving. What is the influence of that on self-concept? And you might take a hit in self-concept, right? So are you guys familiar with the big fish and the small pond effect? Yeah, so that's essentially would be a contextual effect, right? So what's the influence of going from a school that's, again, maybe mediocre, where you're high achieving, and then going to someplace like Princeton? What's the effect of that? So that would be a contextual effect. So again, we might have these interesting questions, but in a multi-level model context, we actually need to center in order to answer those questions, right? So there's two types of centering that we can do within this context at level one. There's only one type of centering at level two, right? It's only grand mean centering because it's the highest level. With level one variables, we can grand mean center our data, where we just take the overall mean and subtract that from each individual data point. And this just represents the deviation from everyone's norm. So this ignores group. And there's also group mean centering, where we take the mean of each group and we subtract that from each individual's data point within that group. And this represents each observation's deviation from their group's norm. This removes the group effect. So it's really important to know that grand mean centering just kind of ignores group, and group mean centering removes that effect of group. That's going to be important when we have these within and between questions. So deciding whether you should do group mean centering or grand mean centering is kind of related to your research questions, right? It's theoretical in nature. So what I have here is kind of just highlighting kind of best practices. So in terms of level one predictors, if you grand mean center your data and you're interested in the within group effect, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to reintroduce the means of level two. So what does that mean? So in this context here, you might be interested in the level one student achievement and self-concept, right? The within school effect. But in order for us to actually assess that, what we're going to need to do is we need to put in the mean student achievement scores at the school level. And by doing that, that will allow us to assess the within school effect. And then we can also look at contextual effects here, right? Because the actual coefficient is the contextual effect associated with the level two group means. My preference is to do group mean centering. And the reason why I like group mean centering is because when you group mean center, that level one variable is already the within subject effect, right? You don't need to reintroduce level two means if you don't want to. However, if you have questions about the between, then you can reintroduce the level two means, and then you get the between school effect too. So this is kind of just a kind of quick and dirty way to centering your variables and answering the questions that you want. It becomes a little bit more complex, especially if we're looking at, we're interested in level two variables or contextual effects. But this is kind of a pretty straightforward way to assess what you should be doing with your variables if you want to answer those questions. And then I have a note here. So generally speaking, we don't usually center our categorical predictors, right? We might dummy code them. We might, use deviation coding. But there's a paper that just came out in 2023 that says that we should be centering our categorical predictors, similar to what we're talking about here with continuous variables. I haven't seen that widely applied. I don't do that to my variables. And I don't know what effect that has, but this is an interesting paper that I have to dig into a little bit more. Does anyone in here do that centering with their categorical variables when they're doing multi-level modeling? Yeah, no. Yeah, no. So basically, it would go through the same process as this. Yeah, so it's very odd. I haven't really dug into it too much, but you would do something like this. But especially if you dummy coded it or you contrast coded it, yeah, it's something that I haven't really looked into. It doesn't really make much sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me, but people do it and they say that you should do it. So, but this paper I'm going to look into a little bit more. But for now, we're not going to do that to our categorical predictors if we have them. So what I have highlighted here are kind of two ways that we can do this in R. The top way is the tidyverse way. And it's fairly straightforward, right? So if we want to get the grand mean centered variable, what we're doing is we're not doing any grouping here. And we're just taking the mean of the overall variable and then subtracting that from each individual data point. And that gives us the grand mean centered variable. If we want to group mean centered, and this is sometimes called centering within cluster, we have to use the group by function, and then we can get the mean for each group, and then we can subtract that from each individual data point within that group. So this is kind of a pretty straightforward by hand to calculate the grand mean centered variable and the group mean centered variable. There's also an easier way to do this that I prefer, and that's from the Data Wizard library. That's part of the Easy Stats ecosystem. So in this class, we're going to be using the Easy Stats ecosystem a lot because I love it. It has really nice functions and really nice packages that make modeling really super easy for everyone. One function that is in the Data Wizard package is called dmean. And this allows you to basically center within the cluster or perform group mean centering. So here we take our data, X, this is just generic, and we select the variable that we want to demean, and then we select our grouping variable. And what I really like about the demean function is that it will return the group mean centered variable, but it will also include the actual group centered variable, the between variable. So the actual mean of the group in the actual data set itself that we can then use and we can put into the model. So I just wanted to highlight with some of the data that we used last week, where we looked at socioeconomic status and let's see if I can get it here. Just gonna copy this. So yeah, we looked at socioeconomic status and math achievement. So in that particular data set, we just have SES as our continuous variable. So I just wanted to highlight how we can easily do that with the demean function. I think that's the right. There you go. So here, this returns a data set that has our group mean centered variable. So this is SS within. And then we also have the SS between, which represents the means of the groups. So again, this you could just put into the analysis. Pretty straightforward. All right, so are there any questions about centering? Again, can't spend too much time on centering, but when we're dealing with continuous variables, it's important to center our variables, especially if we have questions as it relates to within between effects. So now I want to talk about model estimation in multi-level model land. So we don't use OLS in multi-level modeling, so ordinary least squares estimation. We use what's called maximum likelihood estimation. And we need to understand this at a conceptual level. We're not going to get into the gory details about maximum likelihood. I don't think we need to. But maximum likelihood estimation is something that is going to come up over and over again with a lot of the models that we're going to be using this semester. So again, it's important to have a general understanding of what maximum likelihood estimation is. So in common parlance, we usually talk about probability and likelihood as synonymous with one another. But in stats land, these are actually pretty different things. So when we talk about probability, we are talking about a distribution with certain parameters that are fixed, right? So if we're talking about a standard normal distribution, it has a mu of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, right? And within probability, the data is allowed to vary, right? So with the standard normal distribution that I have depicted here, right, we have a mu of 0 and a sigma of 1. And what we could do is we could calculate the area under the curve for different values. So what's the probability that y is greater than 0? We know that's 0.5. What about y between -1 and 1? We know that's 0.68. What about y between 0 and 1? We know that's 0.34. And then y greater than 2, we know that's 0.02, right? So that's kind of probability. That's kind of what we're used to, right, when we're doing statistics. In contrast, what likelihood is the likelihood of varying parameters while the data is fixed. So it's important to note here that the data is fixed and the distribution can change. With probability, the parameters are fixed and the data can change. And within likelihood, what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine which parameter values are more likely or which values have higher likelihood. And to highlight that, let's say that we just have a data point, let's say it's just 0.5. Within the likelihood approach, what we're doing is we're fitting different distributions with different parameters, right? So we have the orange distribution, which has a mu of 0.5 and a sigma of 2. And then we also have another blue distribution, which has a mu of 0 and a sigma of 1, right? And what we can do is we can see where that data point, that 0.5 data point lies on that distribution. And we can determine the likelihood of that particular value in that distribution, right? We're looking at the y-axis here in PDF. So we can see in this particular case, the orange distribution, the likelihood is 0.2. And then on the blue distribution, we see that the likelihood is 0.35. So the likelihood here is higher than the likelihood here. So we'd say that that distribution fits that data point better than the orange one. So let's take a look at another visual example to make this a little bit more concrete. Let's say we have a whole bunch of data values here, and we just want to fit a distribution, a normal distribution, right? So that distribution has a mu, and we can calculate the likelihood of those data points in that distribution. And what we would do is we would take these data points, right? We would find where they fall on this line right here and then get the likelihood. And we would do this for each value. And then what we would do is we'd multiply those together and we get a likelihood value. Then we fit another distribution that has a different mu. And we could do the same thing where we find where it falls on the line, grab that likelihood value, and then we multiply them together. Then we do that again, and then again, and again. The basic idea of maximum likelihood is that it's this iterative process where we're fitting a whole bunch of distributions with particular parameters and calculating the likelihood for that distribution. So what we have here, right, we have for this particular distribution, we get a likelihood value. For this one, we get a likelihood value, and so forth and so on. And essentially what we would do is we would pick the distribution or the parameters that maximize the likelihood of the data. And this would be the one that's on top here, right? That's essentially maximum likelihood in a nutshell. There's a really cool interactive visualization that I particularly like that kind of goes more in depth into maximum likelihood. So if that's something that you're really interested in, you could take a look at this website. But again, this highlights or reiterates what we just talked about, right? Where we have some sample data here and we have a mu of 80 and a sigma of 100, and we can calculate the likelihood of that data according to that distribution, right? And we can also change the mu here, right? And we can see how this changes the likelihood by changing the mu and sigma. And we would go with the best model, or the one that has the highest maximum likelihood. That would be the best model, the one that fits the data the best. So I think that this is really cool visualization. Any questions so far about maximum likelihood? Again, conceptually, I think it's pretty straightforward, but please let me know if you have any questions. And then it goes into some of the math, the calculus here too, and different algorithms. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely recommend checking out this website. So I don't know if you noticed on that website though, but it used log likelihood values and not just regular likelihood values. So the reason for this is that when we multiply lots and lots of numbers together, they can get really small, really fast. And that causes computation errors. So what we tend to do is we take the log of the likelihood instead, because it's just easier to work with. And what we usually use these log likelihood values for is just to tell us how well the model fits the data. So higher values of log are better. And what we can do is we can take this log likelihood value and multiply it by -2, and it gives us a deviance value. And what's really neat about the deviance value is that it follows a chi-square distribution. And the chi-square distribution has one parameter, and that's degrees of freedom, right? So this is just a visualization of our chi-square distribution with different distributions with different degrees of freedom here. And here the degrees of freedom is just the sample size minus the number of parameters in our model -1. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to compare nested models. So if you remember last semester, we looked at F values, which essentially compare a reduced model to a full model, right? Same thing here. With nested models here, we are comparing two models, a full model to a reduced model. That makes it nested. And essentially we're testing two hypotheses here. Right? So our null hypothesis is that the smaller model is better, or the more parsimonious one is better. An alternative is that the larger model is better. And how we test these models is by using what's called the likelihood ratio test. Sometimes this is called the drop-in deviance test. So we're comparing these two models to one another, and we want to see which model is better, the full model or the reduced model. So as I said, within the drop-in deviance test or the likelihood ratio test, we have two hypotheses that we're testing. The null hypothesis would be that the smaller model is better, and the alternative would be that the larger model is better. So if our p-value is less than 0.05, we would say that the more complex model is preferred. But if p is greater than 0.05, then we would say that the more parsimonious model is preferred, right? The test statistic is just basically the difference in the log likelihood for the reduced model and the full model. And then again, this is chi-squared distributed, right, with degrees of freedom, where we take the difference between the reduced model and the full model. And that's how we do our hypothesis testing. So drop-in deviance test, likelihood ratio test is widely used within just model fitting. So we're going to come back to this likelihood ratio test. Now we're going to come back to it when we talk about structural equation modeling and path analysis, and also all the other stuff that we're going to do here. So it's going to be very important to what we're going to be doing going forward. Yeah.
It doesn't penalize for the complexity of the model?
What was that?
Does it penalize for the complexity of the model? There's only one factor.
Yeah, so it doesn't penalize. So there's other types of criteria that we might use, like AIC and BIC, that penalizes for the number of parameters in the model.
But in that case, wouldn't the larger model is always better because you can always set the extra parameter to 0? And it's why is it needed for the comparison?
I don't think that the larger model would always be better. So again, we're doing the difference in the degrees of freedom between the two, right? And that's chi-squared, yeah. So that determines whether it's significant. So do we need to put the extra parameters in there, or it doesn't matter? We should just go with the more parsimonious model. So, but there are indices like AIC and BIC that do penalize the model. And then we can do the comparison between those two. Does that answer your question, Ham?
You know, surface level,
yeah.
I know how to calculate it.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. So to test deviance, we can use our an ANOVA function. So we've used this before to calculate the f-test. But if we want to look at the likelihood ratio, what we need to do is we need to add this argument called test equals chi-square, and that's going to perform our likelihood ratio test. There's also a function in EasyStats called test likelihood ratio that I prefer, that allows you to compare these models and extract the chi-square value. It doesn't matter which one you use, but both of these can perform the likelihood ratio test, looking at nested models or comparisons between those models. So within multi-level modeling, there's two flavors of maximum likelihood that I wanted to kind of briefly discuss. So maximum likelihood is sometimes called full information maximum likelihood, or FIML. And within this particular estimation, we use all of the data, all the sample data, to estimate the fixed effects and the variance components here. And then we use this to draw conclusions about those effects. The issue here is because the issue with maximum likelihood is that it's biased because we're using all of the sample data to estimate these things, right? There's no penalty associated with the estimation. So it's been suggested that we use something called restricted maximum likelihood. This doesn't use all of the sample data. It just uses the sample's residuals, right? So we estimate the variance components. And this is conditional on the fixed effects, so it counts for that uncertainty. And this results in an unbiased estimate of our variance components. And again, this is associated with error or penalty, right? So an analogy that I like to use is how we calculate the sample variance and the population variance. So do you know the difference between the two, right? Ham is shaky, yeah. What's the difference between the two?
Well, the sample variance is just standard deviation squared sample, right? But then the full distribution variance is drawn, the sample is drawn from the full distribution.
Yeah.
So you find the inference of the variance.
Yeah.
And you have to divide, I think the maximum likelihood estimation is like divided by n-1.
Yep. Yeah, n-1, yeah.
Divided by n.
Yeah, yep, correct. Yeah, so that's the main difference, right? So with the population variance, we divide by n, but with sample, we take n-1, right? To make it less biased estimate. Same thing here, where we're doing the restricted maximum likelihood, we account for that bias by looking at the sample residuals, conditional on the fixed effects. So which one do we use, maximum likelihood or restricted maximum likelihood? And when we have lots of data, the two don't really matter too much, but you should use restricted maximum likelihood when you have lots of parameters. So if you have a very complex model and try to fit it with maximum likelihood, it could take a while to fit. Restricted maximum likelihood kind of reduces that computation. If you want reliable estimates of the various parameters, then you should fit with restricted maximum likelihood. And with restricted maximum likelihood, you can only compare nested variance models. You cannot look at differences in fixed effects when you fit with restricted maximum likelihood. Again, it's based on the sample residuals, right? So you can only look at nested variance models here. If your questions pertain to fixed effects, so if you want to compare a main effects model to an interaction model, then you would need to fit the model with maximum likelihood, because again, that uses all of the data. So in this case where I have two models here, X and Y, should we fit this model, should we fit these models with maximum likelihood or restricted maximum likelihood? Yeah, maximum likelihood. So why would we fit this with maximum likelihood and not restricted maximum likelihood? No. So look at the fixed effects. So what are we comparing in those two models? Yeah, interaction. So we have a main effects model versus an interaction model, right? So there's the extra parameter, but we're looking at fixed effects. So if we want to look at fixed effects and compare them, we need to fit the model with maximum likelihood versus restricted maximum likelihood. What about these two models? Look at the random components. What's the difference between the random components?
Maybe restricted because the top one's nested.
So what's the difference between how we structured the random components in the X model compared to the Y model here? So how does this one differ from this one? Right. That's the only thing that's different between those two models, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here we'd use restricted maximum likelihood because we're looking at difference in variance components, right? So here we have a random slope, random intercept, and here we only have a random intercept, right? So here we might be interested in, do we need a random intercept, random slope model? Or can we just go with a random intercept model? Here we can fit the models with restricted maximum likelihood. And this is a lot to keep in memory. Luckily, a lot of the packages that we use will just refit the model for you. So if you are interested in comparing fixed effects and you estimated it with the wrong maximum likelihood estimator, it doesn't matter. It'll rerun the model with the correct estimator. So it doesn't matter too much. But again, it's important to know the distinction and when you apply one versus the other. All right. So are there any questions about maximum likelihood? Again, I just want you guys to have a kind of high level conceptual understanding of maximum likelihood. No need to get into the calculus of it or anything, but just kind of understand a little bit about it and what's going on. So now I want to shift focus and talk about fitting and interpreting models. So you might have the question, what model do I start with? And there's two general approaches to modeling and multi-level modeling. There's a forward-backward approach where we work from a very simple model to something that's more complex. We could also work backwards if we wanted to, right? So for instance, we might fit a very simple null model, which is a random intercepts model. Then we might fit another model that has our fixed effects, maybe our main effects. Then we would fit another model that has our interactions. Then we fit another model that has maybe random slopes, et cetera, et cetera. What I wanted to do is highlight how we might do this approach with our data. So we would want to fit what's called a null model first. That would be kind of our simplest model here. Let's see, I think it's mean people. So we can use the 1 because we just want to estimate fixed intercepts. So this would be the basic, one of the most basic models, which would be the null model here, where we're just fitting random intercepts. Then we might fit another model that has our fixed effects, right? So in our case, it's fairly simple, right? Because we only have one fixed effect, right? So vocode. So something like this. And then what we'd want to do is we want to create a more complex model. Let's say we're going to add random slopes here. So hopefully you can see kind of how we've increased the complexity of the model with each additional model, right? We started with a null model, then we added a model that just has a fixed effect vocode, still same random effect structure. Then we added a random slope to our model here, right? So again, we're going from a random intercept model to a random slope and random intercept model here, right? And then what we would do is we do likelihood ratio test to test which model is better. That's kind of the forward approach in a nutshell. We can also work back from the maximal model down if we wanted to. Just real quick, why would we include vocode here as a random slope? So if you remember what I talked about last week about including random slopes, what do random slopes have to do? The actual variables themselves. If vocoding only had one level, let's say natural speech, could I include that as a random slope? No. So anything that you put as a random slope needs to vary within the cluster or higher level unit. So here we have 2 levels, right? Natural speech and vocoded speech. So that's allowed to vary. We can estimate a rate of change for that. If there's only one value, then we can't put a random slope on that. And that's a common thing that I see people doing is people putting random slopes on things that shouldn't be there. So it's important to know that it must change within that cluster in order for it to have a random slope. So this is kind of a forward approach to multi-level modeling. My preferred approach is to just fit a maximal model. And this is related to this Barr et al. 2013 paper, where they suggest that we just keep it maximal. So this is the idea that whatever can vary in your data should vary. In our example, subjects can vary and the vocoded effect can vary within subject. So this would be our maximal model here. And this paper, and there's several other papers, have done some simulation studies showing that fitting a maximal model decreases type 1 error rate. So if you're fitting a model that doesn't include the maximal structure, you're increasing type 1 error rate, and you're going to make erroneous inferences, which is something that you don't want. So it's always preferable to fit your maximal model. And again, sometimes this is not possible. In my world, it's possible. I'm not working with 50, 60 variables, but maybe in the social sciences, social psych, you're working with lots of variables. It's possible that you can't, have a maximal model. The more parameters you have in your model, the more data that you need in your model, or the more data that you need to fit that model. So what happens sometimes is when we fit this maximal model, we run into kind of 2 issues. There's convergence issues, so our model basically doesn't converge. And to understand this, we need to think about maximum likelihood estimation. So what's happening in maximum likelihood estimation? We're essentially doing this iterative process trying to find the best parameters for our data. And we're doing this thousands of times, maybe even millions of times. And sometimes we don't find those best parameters, right? It just stops computing, maybe because the iterations are set to a particular number and it just does not find an adequate solution. This would lead to non-convergence in our model here. So what are some steps that we can take to address this non-convergence? So I have here listed several things that you can do. The first option would be to try a different optimizer. So there's a default optimizer in LME4 or LMER that they use. Maybe that's not the best optimizer or the best algorithm that it's using. So there's a function from Apex called allfit that will basically go through a whole host of different optimizers, and it will pick the ones that converge or the best ones. So we can look at that here and see what that looks like. Let's see here. So I have a max model here. So what it will do is it'll go through kind of a whole host of different optimizers, and it'll say if it converged or it didn't converge. And then what we can do is we can pick an optimizer that converges. So this is the preferable first approach, right? Because we're not messing with that random maximal structure. But sometimes that doesn't work and we can't find a good optimizer. So what do we do in that case? The first step would be to sort out our random effects first. So it's been suggested that we remove correlations between slopes and intercepts. Those are usually not theoretically important to us for the most part. It kind of just estimates it when we fit a random slope. So let's remove that first. If we still get non-convergence error, then we can look at our random slopes. Again, that adds to the complexity of the model. So we remove random slopes. Then if that doesn't work, we can remove random intercepts. And if that still doesn't work, then we have to turn to our fixed effects. And usually maybe it'd be an interaction that we need to remove, right? Because that increases the complexity of the model. Once we have a converged model, then we want to present that using REML estimation. Yeah.
Correlation between slopes and intercepts.
So I'm going to talk about that in the random. Yeah. So basically, it's basically like a regular correlation, right? So looking at the association between the random slope and the intercept.
Is that specifying the model? Isn't the model just specifying slopes, intercepts?
Yep. So if you're estimating by default, if you put a random slope and a random intercept, it'll estimate the covariance between those two things automatically.
You have to specify not to.
Yeah, not to do that. Yep. Another issue that we might run into is that your model is singular. Again, I stress check your output for these things, and I'll show you an example of what this might look like. But there's two reasons why you might have a singular output or singularity. The variance that you're estimating is close to zero, or you have a perfect correlation between your random intercept and random slope, 1 or -1. So if you think about how we estimate the variance covariance matrix, so underlying all of this is lots of matrix algebra, and we take an inverse of a matrix, and if we have perfect correlations, that causes estimation issues. So we need to take special care in looking at these things. We might be fitting random effects in our model that there's just no variability, right? So we need to look at our output, and there might be a perfect correlation that's causing errors. My suggestion would be just to drop that particular random effect from the model because it's causing issues. So the data that we're working with today doesn't have those issues, but the data that we used last week looking at socioeconomic status and math achievement does have those issues. So here's the data that you can read in, and then this is the model that we're fitting. We're fitting a random slope, random intercept model here. And we can look at the summary output. And if we scroll down, we can see that convergence is okay, but we see that there's a singularity issue here. So our data is singular, and we don't want to infer from our model based on this error, right? We don't want to just proceed on like everything is okay. That's not good. So we need to address this. So if we look at the random effects output, what we can see here is that the correlation is -1. So there's a perfect negative correlation here. That's probably causing the singularity issue here. So what we can do is we can remove the random intercept slope correlation. And to do that, we just need to use double pipes. And by using double pipes, it will remove that correlation. And if we rerun the model, there will be no convergence issues, there will be no singularity issues here. So we have solved the problem and we can proceed on with our model here. So make sense? Kind of. Traditionally, we usually fit what's called a null model or an unconditional means model first. And the reason why we would fit a null model first is to get what's called the interclass correlation coefficient. So last week, I talked about instances where we might not want to use a multi-level model. And one of those cases is that there is no interdependence in our data. There is no variability between clusters. So how do we assess that? We can use the ICC. The ICC is a standardized way of telling us how much variance there is due to the clustering or grouping factor. And the ICC value ranges between 0 to 1. If our ICC is 0, that means that there is no variability between clusters. If it's 1, it means that all of the variability is between clusters. Additionally, we can interpret this ICC value as a correlation. So the correlation among observations within the cluster or group. If our ICC is 0, that means that there is no correlation or dependence within clusters. If it's 1, that means that all of the observations are perfect replicates of one another here. Generally speaking, if the ICC is low, less than 0.1, then we don't have to use multi-level modeling. However, you probably should, unless it's 0, because you do want to account for that variability, right? Even if it's small, but just refer to whatever your field does. So let's go ahead and fit a null model here, or unconditional means model, or sometimes called random intercepts model. And what we're doing here is we're just fitting a model with our DV, and we're just fitting a random intercept model here, right? So we have one which allows the intercepts to vary, and then we have subject. And you'll notice here that I'm just setting REML to true. REML equals true is the default. So sometimes you'll see that I haven't included that. That's just because we're using the default here. So if we look at the summary output from this null model, we'll see some metadata at top right. So it says that the linear model was fit by RMEL. It also says that t-tests use Satterthwaite's method. I don't think I'm pronouncing that name right, but that's okay. And then you get the formula that we fit, and then also the data that's being used. We also have some REML criterion values here, not that important. Scaled residuals, so some descriptives for our residuals, again, not really important. What's important here is this random effect structure here. In this unconditional means model, we haven't included any predictors. So what we can extract from here is the variability between subjects, which is represented here, right? So we have our group, which would be our random factor subject, and then we have a random effect here, intercept, and then the variability associated with that and the standard deviation. We also have our within subject error, or which is our residual term, which is 0.00168. So we can use this information to calculate the ICC. And the ICC is essentially just the between group variability. So the variability between groups here, so the intercept variance, divided by the between group variability and the residual, right? So the total variance in our model. So it's fairly straightforward. And if we look at this, if we actually do this by hand, right, we could take the variance. And so we take the between subject variability, and then we divide that by the total variability in our model. We get an ICC of 0.07. So should we run a multi-level model on this data? Yes, no? What do you guys think? So the ICC is 0.07.
No.
Yeah, I mean, probably not. So if it's less than 0.10, I probably shouldn't run a multi-level model on it. However, there is still some variability, so we're still going to run a multi-level model. But you know, a reviewer, if I was a reviewer on a paper, I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't mind if they didn't use a multi-level model on this. So we can do this by hand, or we can just have a package calculate this for us. So performance from the EasyStats ecosystem has an ICC function, so we can feed in our model, and it will output the interclass correlation coefficient. So this provides two ICCs, an adjusted ICC, which is just for the random effects portion, and then the unadjusted ICC is conditioned on the fixed effects. So again, you can calculate this by hand, or you can just use a function to calculate the ICC. Doesn't matter. So let's go ahead and fit our maximal model. So we fit our null model, right, where we just have random intercepts. Now we're going to fit our maximal model, which has a fixed effect to vocode, and then it has a random slope and a random intercept. And that's specified here, right? So anything to the left of the pipe is going to be a random slope. Anything to the right of the pipe is going to be a random intercept. And here we're fitting the maximal model, right? Because we are also estimating the correlation between the random intercept and the random slope. So this is the summary output that we're looking at here. What I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about the random effect structure and the fixed effect structure independently from one another. So we get a sense of what's being stated. So let's take a look at the fixed effects structure first, or the fixed effects output. So if we just use the summary function on our linear model that we fit, we're going to get a whole bunch of output here. And I just want to focus on this fixed effects output here. So this is kind of what we care about, right? These are what we do hypothesis testing on, right? We have our intercept value here, and we also have our slope value here. So let's interpret the intercept and the slope in our model. So I did not apply any special type of coding to our categorical predictor. So in that case, what type of coding does R apply to our categorical predictor if I didn't apply any type of special coding scheme? Was that? Yeah, so R applies dummy coding if you don't specify any type of coding. So the reference condition in that case is whatever comes first alphabetically. So what does our intercept represent in this case? So same interpretation as just a regular linear model. So what is this 0.004 around? So we have one predictor in our model. It has two levels. Don't fail me. It's the mean of what?
Non-liquid speech.
Yep. So it's the mean of the normal speech condition, right? So what does our slope represent then? Here.
Meaning of liquid speech.
Oh.
The change in assessment.
Yep. Exactly, kind of. Yep. So it's a change in the pupil size from the normal speech condition to the vocoded condition. So this represents our difference. And this is statistically significant. So we can go ahead and publish this, right? We have a statistically significant difference between the two conditions. So that's how you basically interpret the fixed effects. Again, similar to a linear model, right? And this doesn't matter if we have interactions, cross-level interactions, if we have level 2 and level 1 variables interacting with one another, similar interpretations. So one issue, a complex issue that I wanted to bring up was the degrees of freedom and p-values issue that you'd be exposed to when doing multi-level modeling. So when we fit our model here, it says that t-tests use the Satterthwaite method here. And the reason why we have this popping up is because I've loaded a package called LMER test. And when you load the LMER test package, it will use this Satterthwaite correction to provide your p-values in the actual output. Did anyone try to run this without running the LMER test function? Has anyone ran the models? Does anyone have any output that does not include a p-value or a DF column? Or have you experienced that in the past? Yeah. Yes, it can be kind of disconcerting, right? So the creator of LME4 doesn't like p-values. He thinks that the topic is pretty complex, so he refuses to put degrees of freedom or p-values there. So if you didn't have any other packages loaded in, you would just get a t-value column, and that's pretty much it. That's called the asymptotic or infinite degrees of freedom approach. So what people have done is, so considering that in linear modeling or mixed linear modeling, we have lots of data, right? Lots of rows, lots of observations. So essentially we just use the asymptotic distribution, which is the Z distribution, and we make inferences based off of that. So if our T value is greater than 1.96, right, it's less than, P would be less than 0.05. So that's one approach that some people use. So the one that I prefer is the Satterthwaite method, which is used when we load in this LMER test function. And it just uses an approximation based off of the cluster size and the number of observations you have to determine the degrees of freedom. It's very complicated. What I really want you to know is to pay attention to what type of degrees of freedom are being computed and to report that, because reviewers want to see that. Honestly, I haven't really noticed lots of differences depending on what type of degrees of freedom approach I use in terms of statistical significance. But reviewers want to see it and you should report it. So I just want you to be aware of that. That depending on what packages you have loaded in, it could calculate the degrees of freedom and the p-values a little differently. So just be aware of that. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the random part of the output. So basically the random part just tells us the variability that's associated or the variability around the fixed intercepts or slopes. So in our particular case, it's just how much does the average pupil size change between participants, and also how does the effect or rate of change differ between the fixed slope. So if we look at the random effects part here, right, we have our groups column. This lists our random factors, which is subject. And then the name column would list our random effects. So we have 2 random effects in our maximal model. Well, I guess 3, but we have random intercepts and we have random slopes. And we get the variance associated with each of those here. This is the overall variance, right? We're not interested in individual level variability, but we'll look at that in a second. This is just the general variability associated across all of our levels. And the variance is very small. It is 0.0001. So again, I don't think that multi-level modeling is particularly useful here. We could probably use another approach that would work the same. But yeah, so the variance is pretty small here in terms of variability between subjects. We can also look at the slope intercepts, or the slope variability, and that is also very small. So the standard deviation is 0.01 for the intercepts and then 0.005 for the slopes. So again, not a lot of variability around these fixed intercepts and slopes. We also have a random correlation between the random intercepts and random slopes. So again, as I said, anytime you fit a random intercept, random slope model, it will also estimate the correlation between the two. Again, that could be interpreted as a regular correlation. So how those two things are related to one another. So in our data, we have a negative correlation. It's negative point. That is not what I want. I'm gonna go here. Sorry. Why is this not? Why is this not running? Here, let's do this. Sorry, I have another. There you go. So this is what the correlation, so if we did a scatter plot of the random correlation between the intercept and the slope or the effect here. And again, we need to realize how we've coded our variables, right, to interpret this. But in our context, the negative correlation represents that for higher intercept. So this is for normal speech. So this is the pupil size for normal speech condition. There's less of an effect. So less of a pupil effect for the low coded effect here. And that makes sense if we understand that the pupil size can only grow so large or oh so big. So if we have high pupil size in the normal speech condition, which is the easier condition, right? When we are exposed to a harder condition like vocoded speech, our pupil can only go so large, right? So if you're already at a higher baseline for the easy condition, then you can't really change that much. So that's what this negative correlation is suggesting here. We have higher intercepts for the normal speech condition, that's less of an effect, or a lower slope for the actual effect. So that's how we would interpret that particular effect. Why that's that. So as I said before, we're mostly interested in general variance, right? That's what the variance term represents in our multi-level modeling, but we can visualize the variability between levels. And the estimate group level function allows us to see the variability between subjects. So we can look at the variability between the intercepts, right? Doesn't look like there's too much variability here, but there does seem to be some moving around, right, from the overall population average effect. And then we can also look at the random slope variability. Again, not too much variability. It is jumping around a little bit, but it seems like it's very similar to the fixed slope of the population average effect here. Again, generally, sometimes we like to visualize this. We don't really use this in terms of our, our inference, we don't really use this kind of theoretically. There is an instance where I've used this. So in item response theory, we might use the actual variability. So I created a test called the Iowa consonant test when I was at the University of Iowa. I helped create it. And what we did during the piloting phase is we fit a whole bunch of items and we put it as a random effect, right? Random intercept. So we can get the variability of each item, can compare that to the average effect. And we can see which items are kind of really far away from the fixed or population average effect. And based off of that, we decided to exclude certain items based off that. So that was really useful to look at the variability between items and determine maybe which items are bad or which items are good. So that's one way that we can use this. But generally speaking, we're kind of just care about the kind of overall general variance that's associated with it, right? So my philosophy is to fit a maximal model. However, you might want to determine, what is the best random effect structure in our model. So what we can do here is we can compare a model with a random intercept to a model with a random intercept and slope, right? And to compare those two things to determine which one is best, we can use the likelihood ratio test function from EasyStats or the ANOVA function. And we can compare those two models and we can determine which one is better. And for the sake of time, I am going to just fit those two models just to see which one is better. See if I can find. Let me just fit this random model. So what I'm doing now is I'm just fitting a model that has the maximal structure to a model that doesn't have that random intercept. So I'm just going to remove this random slope. So let's see. Let's just do ANOVA. So this is non-significant. So what we can infer from this is that we probably should go with the simpler model. So we should probably remove those random slopes and just have a random intercept model. So this is how we would do the model comparison if we were trying to figure out what the best random effect structure is to our model. So that's one way that we could do that. So let's do. So likelihood ratio tests are used for nested models, right? When we're comparing a full model to a model that has all of our variables sans one, right? So a simpler model compared to a full model or a more complex model. If we are trying to compare two models that have different maybe fixed effect structures, we can't use the likelihood ratio test. So we need to use AIC and BIC. So the AIC essentially is just the deviance value plus 2 times the number of parameters in our model. So it has that penalty. And we can compare AICs by looking at the difference in AICs between 2 models that we're interested in. So AIC sub I minus AIC min. So this would be the model with the smallest AIC, or the best model. And generally speaking, the change in AIC score, the larger it is, the more evidence there is for the more complex model. So that's the one that you'd want to go with. We also have BIC, which is the Bayesian information criterion. This is based off the deviance plus the log of the sample size times the number of parameters in your model. Here, we can just compare the 2 BIC models similarly to the AIC. And if the change in BIC is less than 2, we say that there's no difference. So the more parsimonious model is preferred. If the BIC is greater than 3, we say that there's evidence for the smaller BIC model. So these are some alternative options that you can use. We can extract the AIC and BIC from the model performance package. So you can see here, we get our AIC values and BIC values from the model if we wanted to do those comparisons. So I want to talk a little bit about fixed effects hypothesis testing. So there are multiple options that we can use to perform hypothesis testing. So there's the option based off of T values, right? So when we run the summary output, it outputs T values. So we can make our inferences based off of that, right? We can also do F tests too, depending on what type of package you use. I could do a parametric bootstrap. The one that I prefer and the one that I'm recommending that you guys use is the likelihood ratio test to perform hypothesis tests on our fixed effects. And the reason why I prefer that is because it can be interpreted as main effects and interactions, right? I think it makes it a lot easier to perform the likelihood ratio test than it would be to look at the summary output, especially if you have lots of variables in your model. So categorical variables, continuous variables, it can make the model very complex and it's going to be hard to make the appropriate inferences. I think the likelihood ratio test kind of simplifies that for us. So that's what I'm recommending doing. And the AFEX package will do this likelihood ratio test for us. So traditionally, what's been done in the past is you do these model comparisons, right? Where we have like a main effect model to an interaction model, right? And you compare them. The AFEX package will just do it all for you in one go. So that, is less burden for us. So in AFEX, there is a package called Mixed that performs the linear mixed effects modeling or multi-level modeling, and it uses the same syntax as the LMER function in LME4. And the only thing that we need to add here is method LRT. So that's going to tell the function to perform a likelihood ratio test. And we can see what the output here. We get our effect, our vocoded effect. This is the main effect. And then we get our chi-square value and then the p-value associated with that. So again, makes our life a lot simpler. Then what we can do is we can follow this up using m-means to get means and pairwise contrasts. So we've used m-means before in this class. We love this package. It makes our life a lot simpler. So with the m-means function, it can extract the means for each group. Again, this is a very simple model. We can use the summary output, and this maps onto that summary output. But when we use m-means, it makes our life simpler when we have lots of different variables in our model. But the m-means function will give us the means for each condition, right? And the standard error and confidence intervals. Then we can also do pairwise contrast here using the pairs function, and we can get the difference between the two conditions and then the associated p-values with that and the confidence intervals associated with that pairwise contrast. So again, makes our life a lot easier. So that's what I would suggest do: perform likelihood ratio test and then follow up comparisons using m-means. So I wanted to talk a little bit about assumptions. So luckily, the assumptions for linear modeling apply to multi-level modeling. So we need to make sure that there's linearity, right, between the predictor and the outcome. Normality is also an assumption of multi-level modeling. So here we have an additional level that we need to check normality for. So we need to make sure that our level 1 residuals are normally distributed, but also our level 2 residuals. We also need to make sure that there's homoscedasticity. So there is constant error variance between the predictor and the residuals. We also need to make sure that there's no multicollinearity in our model and that there's no outliers. Luckily, we can use easy stats and the check model function. Why is this not interesting? I'm just gonna do, for some reason, my images are not coming up properly, but do. See how long it'll take to do it. So we can use the check model function, and it will output this nice little figure. Let's see if it'll. There we go. So when we just use this one line of code, it's going to output our assumption checks, right? So we can check for linearity. So we want this line to be horizontal and flat. So that looks pretty good. Homogeneity of variance looks okay, not the best. There doesn't seem to be any outliers here. The residuals at the level 1 look a little wonky here, but the residuals at level 2 look pretty good. What I would probably do in this case would probably be log transform the dependent variable to fix the normality of residuals at level 1. So same things that we talked about in terms of linear modeling can be applied to multi-level modeling, right? But then there's that extra level that we have to take into account. So in terms of visualization, there's lots of different ways that we can visualize our models. This is one way to visualize the data. Again, these are our rain cloud plots. But what we want to include at least is the population average effects. So that's this purple line right here with 95% confidence intervals associated with it. And then what I have is individual data points for each subject. So this is the mean per subject and then connected by line. So when we have dependent variable like this, right, where we have individuals in both conditions, we'd want something like this to indicate that it is a paired design. So this is one type of visualization. This requires a little bit of ggplot code to do. There is a function from ggeffects called ggmeans that will output a visualization for you in one line of code. And this is just the population average effects, right, for the normal speech and the vocoded condition here. Again, one line of code. And we can also include our random effects into this model as well. What that will do is that will significantly increase the 95% confidence intervals that we have here. Sometimes that doesn't look very nice, but it'd probably be a good idea to include the random effects into this visualization here. But what we have here is just the population average effects. Let's see here. So the last thing I'll talk about are effect sizes in multi-level modeling. And as most things in multi-level modeling, it's complex and it's complicated. And there's a whole host of different effect size measures that you can use in multi-level modeling. And I'm only going to present a couple. Again, your lab, the field that you're in might have, want you to use a particular effect size measure. That's fine. So in multi-level model world, we can't perform where we can't, what am I trying to say? So in multi-level modeling world, we can't use sums of squares, right? So in regular ordinary least squares regression, we use our sum of squares to calculate our R squared. In multi-level modeling, it's highly complex, right? There's multiple levels, multiple sources of variability that we need to take into account. So what's been suggested is kind of an overall model R squared or pseudo R squared. Again, it's pseudo because we're not using, sums of squares to calculate this thing. So what's been recommended is that you calculate 2 R squareds, one for the one for the marginal component or the fixed effects component of your model, and then one for the conditional model, which is the full model. So the fixed effects and random effects together. And these are the equations for those two, pretty straightforward. So calculating the conditional and the marginal. So we'd want to report this. So we're not reporting only one R squared, we're reporting multiple R squareds. One for the conditional and then one for the marginal. And then in terms of individual level predictors, I would suggest calculating semi-partial R squared. So does anyone remember what semi-partial correlation is, or what a semi-partial correlation is? So basically it tells us the effect of a particular predictor over and above other predictors in the model, right? So it's semi-partial, right? So we're only removing it from one part of the equation, right? Where we have the DV and then we have our predictor variables. So basically it's kind of almost like a hierarchical regression, right? Where we're stepwise adding these things into our model. So it tells us over and above all the other predictors how much variance it predicts. So
What is Shapley value?
a what?
Shape theory?
I have no idea what that is. It like a hierarchical stepwise type of thing?
I know this for like collaborative games, the
Okay.
contribution of each player in the game.
Oh, interesting. You might have to send me some stuff on that. Yeah, no, I haven't heard of that before. So real quick, you can calculate the R squared by using the performance function. That'll give you the conditional and marginal effects. You can also calculate the semi-partial R squared for the predictors in your model by using part R2. So it makes our life easier here. And I have some sample code for that we'll use on Wednesday. And then the last thing I want to talk about, when we have treatment effects in our model, we can apply Cohen's d. And this is one equation for Cohen's d that you can use. There's a paper that came out a couple months ago that lists a whole bunch of different other equations to calculate Cohen's d that I recommend if that's what you're interested in. But this is just a general equation to calculate Cohen's d, which is the effect, which is the difference between the two, and then divided by the variance of the intercept, the slope variance if we have a random slope, and the residual variance, right? We take the square root of that, the standard deviation. And we can use m-means to calculate this for us, right? So we feed in our model, and then we can use the f_size package. And we need to make sure that we include the sigma that we calculated here. And we need to also include the degrees of freedom from our model here. And it will output a effect size measure, which is negative 0.078 or negative 0.08, which is fairly small. So we have a very small effect in our data here. But this is how you would calculate Cohen's d for our particular model. All right, so that is all the time I have. So we'll pick this up on Wednesday.